All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Jay Adelson. Jay is a serial entrepreneur who founded many companies such as Equinix, Dig, Revision 3, Opsmatic, Scorebit, where he's actually coming to us live today from the Scorebit lab, and many other companies, some successful, some less so. And Jay has been twice featured in Time Magazine's top 100 most influential people in the world list. And today I'm going to be taking Jay down memory lane a little bit, as I have a special interest in what went right and what went wrong with one of his early internet companies, dig.com, which was trying to democratize the media and was at one point considered the homepage of the internet. So Jay, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I let you know before we started that I really did my homework before this call. So I hope to not ask you too many questions that you've already addressed publicly, because there is a lot of your content out there, especially with the still very popular Ask Jay YouTube channel, which we'll get into later. But one of the things that I came across in some of your talks is that you kind of consider yourself an emotional founder, or at least an emotionally driven entrepreneur. And I'm curious if you can elaborate on this. I know that you've also talked about kind of how you mitigate or check the downside risks of that. But talk to us a little bit about what it means to be an emotionally driven founder and to have that awareness, and how that maybe compares to how other people are motivated in their thought processes.
No, it is an excellent question because I do think it's glossed over often how different founders find different inspiration or ambition. There is an incredible variety, and I've advised, hundreds of entrepreneurs over the years. And to me, that emotional piece is largely an inability for me to not take it very personally. And it is a weakness, and it is a strength. And I think a lot of founders always say, oh, well, it's an emotional experience. It's something that I'm driven. And so they feel this passion for something. But for me, it extends to the point where, my startups have become an extension of me. And that creates problems because obviously it takes you on the ups and downs at such a significant level that it can create a lot of stress. It means that your co-founders and your employees are probably more like family, and it's less of a business, and it's more of a sort of a familial kind of thing, which in the early stages can be absolutely, game changing. But as the company scales and the KPIs become clearer and clearer, I think that there is a necessary detachment or abstraction that a founder typically has to have in order to just scale the business. And so I think in my career, that transition, I've done that. I've made that transition, but it's been a hard transition for me, to be honest. And I question whether or not we should be doing that. That is sort of the higher level question. I don't know if I have the answer for it, but different. You'll hear the stories about these great CEOs that are data driven and have been able to make incredible decisions as a result of that resulted in powerful companies. Sometimes I think the sacrifice just isn't worth it.
Yeah. Okay. And if I could get you to tap into that raw emotion for this next question, because I know you have some perspectives here, and I think the situation is becoming more apparent to news consumers everywhere. But if you could tap into that emotion for a second, what is it that you really don't like about the news media today? What about it is broken or really pisses you off?
My brother Scott is a journalist and, was trained formally in journalism. And we have these wonderful conversations all the time about democratized media and is it possible, and the value of editorial. The issue is that there was a long time where media, or I should say journalistic, outlets, whether it be a newspaper or magazine or television, there was a certain responsibility they felt, and thus had this respect from the audience around truth and around fact checking, investigative journalism, willingness to sort of stay fair and unbalanced. And I think that the failed experiment was that we thought that if we handed editorial over using different methodologies like crowd wisdom, that we might be able to get or surface something that I used to call importance, which is what an editor is supposed to decide, that we could somehow algorithmically surface importance. And I think the conclusion I've come to is we can't. And that editorial does serve a very important role, and that editorial has let us down, particularly over the last 10 years.
So you don't think that kind of crowdsourced wisdom, or there's a lot of different names for this. I've even heard you use different names, such as collaborative filtering is a term that you've used before, this recommendation engine, however you want to refer to it. You don't think that this is an ability that the internet unlocked that would be useful to improve kind of our news media landscape, even if we were holding the media accountable?
Well, that's exactly the issue. I think that type of system has value because it brings interesting subjects to the forefront. And it's important to distinguish between interesting and importance. And this is a subjective view, of course, but the problem is information cascades are just too easy to fall prey to, and this is like the classic dig example, but Reddit or other platforms where it takes a formally trained individual or set of individuals to understand how to question the facts and do it in a fair and sort of methodical way. I think that there are possibilities of inventing new forms of media that take all these lessons into account and this accountability that you're talking about, sort of the feedback loop that would hold even an algorithm accountable, reputation scores and certifications and different processes. No one's done that yet. We haven't seen a successful implementation of that yet. And I hope people keep trying, because the problem is trust. We trust the public as a group. We have difficulty trusting an individual publication for all sorts of reasons. And so either we regain that trust somehow through changing the way that these individual publications behave, or we find another way, right, to surface importance.
Yeah. Do you think it's fair to say that trust in today's digital age is built by being able to transparently see the feedback of your fellow consumers?
I think that the transparency of that is important when you have a ranking. So if you have some kind of, if you come up with an importance algorithm, it has to be fully transparent. But here's the problem, and here's why I think there's a catch-22. I feel that the second you expose negative signal of any kind, those information cascades become controlling. They define you. And in the dig experience, we learned that very quickly, early in the dig experience, that we had to hide berries. Berries was when you sort of thumbs down on something. And because if we exposed them, everything broke. So it was just a terrible platform. But when we hit it, it was fine. When we chose to expose the dig, which we thought was a positive signal and kind of counteracted some of those things, and it actually created equal problems, and corruption and dig brigades and other things. And so the transparency is important, but the transparency has to be very thoughtful in terms of preventing those cascades. And the more important transparency is editorial transparency around, or journalistic transparency around how these sources are checked. Are there in fact 2 or more sources for a piece of news data? But also, how do we surface what is important? Is photos of Britney Spears, in the classic dig, story, more important than an overthrowing of a government, which was on the same homepage and ranked lower than Britney Spears? So, how is that actually achieved? And back to the catch-22, if you expose that, can it be gamed?
Yeah.
This is the issue.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to dive into with, is kind of this concept of having power users on a site and the value of having that downvote button, which for listeners who don't know, Dig very famously basically created the modern upvote or like button, whatever kind of iteration we see it in today, and all these different feature sets on different social platforms. The Dig button and the Berry button really were the first upvote and downvote. And so I think it's especially interesting to ask you about this downvote feature, because YouTube just announced yesterday or today that they are going to now be getting rid of the dislike or the thumbs down button on YouTube. So what changes do you envision happening on the YouTube experience now that they're going to be removing that? Is that a good decision? Is it in all cases good to remove the negative signal?
My experience would say yes, it's a good idea to remove the negative signal. Understanding that they serve different purposes. So a classic example of a negative signal that is helpful is if I can somehow mark something as a type of story that is not relevant to me, right? And be able to say, hey, this is not something I want in my feed or what have you, or to report something as inaccurate. The whole idea of crowd wisdom, the James Soriecki concept was, if you know the classic story about guessing the weight of a yak, right? Or an ox, where if you don't show everyone, if you ask 100 people to write the weight down on a piece of paper and you don't show everyone no one could see each other's answers, and then you collect it all and you average it, it's almost always accurate. And so the key being, you can't see each other's signal, right? And that goes in both directions. So when trying to determine whether or not something is bad content, if you have 1 million people looking at it, if you have a sophisticated negative signal that you can collect without exposing it, you can sometimes take that and apply it to some kind of reporting system so that your editors or your other users can know that this content might be flawed in some way. It can work. At large volumes, it can work. It can't work where you have an influencer telling others to downvote it. And this is you see the crux of it. So I think getting rid of a negative signal that people can see is a really great idea. The question is then, how can you then leverage your users to find things for you that are wrong?
Yeah. And that comes back to this idea of collaborative filtering. And in one of your talks that I listened to, you accurately identified Google as an example of collaborative filtering that maybe people don't think of the way they think of Reddit or Dig or even Facebook as collaborative filtering. But the PageRank algorithm was really the innovation there that allowed for them to become the superior search results. And that really is kind of maybe a less direct version of collaborative filtering. So I'm curious, where are you seeing this concept of collaborative filtering emerging in new and interesting ways today?
I want to tell you that I'm seeing a lot of good applications of it today. I mean, I think that we became dominated by a few very powerful social media companies over the past 10 years. And so, unfortunately, there is a direct correlation, whenever there is a direct correlation between a company's revenue, right, and the popularity of something, the nature of the policing changes, because what you consider to be a story that is valuable to your users is based on what is going to be clicked on. So if something sensational is actually good. So in those cases, you're actually removing some of these filters from the negative signaling. And the collaborative filters become more discovery tools to find more sensational components and stories. And so I haven't really seen it used well. And I know people at Reddit, and I know there are a lot more ways to use that signal secretly to identify problem users sometimes, or identify problem areas. But in terms of news, in terms of actually specifically for news, I haven't seen really us go in a forward direction, only a negative one.
Okay. And a couple of these next questions are ones where I might expect you to try to wiggle your way out of. And obviously you'll answer as you see fit. I can't make you say anything you don't want to say, but I do have some questions that that might be, maybe now looking back, the distance you have from Dig, maybe now you can maybe speak to some of these things. So first, you're mentioning Reddit, which is obviously one of the largest social media platforms, and perhaps a spin-off in some ways of Dig's original site. We don't need to get into that, but how do you, looking back on those days when Reddit was from the outside seemingly trying to poach users, and in some ways very publicly doing things like adding changing their logo to kind of welcome Dig users onto Reddit, and especially during kind of the Dig version 4 upgrade and kind of the fallout of that, being very public about trying to attract those users from Dig. Do you think it's possible that the Reddit team was in some ways had their hands inside of Dig and inside the site itself, doing things to kind of maybe create some of these issues, or an internal coup of some kind to actually hamper Dig itself to create that kind of exodus to Reddit?
I'll be honest with you. I don't think so. I had a lot of interactions with Reddit back then, and just for your listeners to be clear, I left Dig in April of 2010, and this was about I think 8 months before Dig v4 came out, and the big mass exodus of Dig users over to Reddit happened, and Reddit started growing at that rate. I feel that there is a natural tendency that when there is a problem or a major user revolt, it's natural that if you have a platform that is similar enough and you open your doors, you're likely to get an advantage in that situation. So I think that Dig created our own problems. We let our users down. And I say we, but the powers that be. And it was an inevitable reaction. I think that in those days, it's really hard to kind of remember this. It's hard to sort of empathize with what we were going through, because Dig had become pretty powerful at the scale of internet at that time in like 2010. And we had a tremendous ability to aim a fire hose of traffic to anybody who got to the front of Dig's homepage. This then led to all sorts of challenges around these top diggers and how they were perceived. And the truth is that we created a market, an SEO market. And if you could figure out how to get something on the top of Dig's page, it was worth a lot of money. And so people started getting paid to recognize this concept of influencer that we know so well today, right, in the Instagram world, really existed back then in the form of this top digger. And so a sponsor might find that individual or a news outlet or what have you. And once that was created, you had this really challenging issue of distinguishing, what was a true consumer of our product versus somebody who was sort of engineering. And we spent a lot of time on that. And they developed huge influence. So if you went against them in any way, you were likely to get, a revolt on your hands. I think that I enjoyed that game. Like first of all, I knew a lot of these top diggers. They were incredible people, and they were not all like corrupt, they legitimately developed their following based on an ability to hunt and find great stories. They were great editors, essentially. And I loved the community. The community was weird. They were awkward. They would get passionate and angry and take down our site and do other things. But I love that stuff. But not all my colleagues did. And so I think that Reddit was able to take advantage of that.
Yeah. And if we can zoom in on that upgrade in particular, many pundits from the outside kind of refer to that as the milestone where after that, everything went downhill. And I'm curious, from somebody who was there on the inside, were things moving, maybe the metrics were moving in a negative direction, and that's why you needed to make the upgrade? Was the upgrade just something that you thought would work or some users were asking for, but maybe you, in retrospect, didn't get enough input on or didn't beta test enough? Like, can you walk us through whether or not you, looking back on it, think that that upgrade was necessary, successful, marks the beginning of the downfall? Where does that sit in your eyes?
It's really, to be clear, so when I left in April of 2010, we had a different product plan that was based on different research and different user feedback. After I left the company, Kevin Rose and everybody involved there tried a different direction. So to make that clear, so the metrics at the time in April of 2010 were starting to slow. They were still growing, but they weren't growing at the J curve like pace that they were, back at the beginning. And that's always frightening for a venture-backed company. We had revenues that were kind of flattening, and it wasn't going down, but there was a lot of competition out there. Twitter was new, Facebook was starting to really explode, and we weren't sure what the future of our product was going to look like. And smartphones were just taking off, right? So our idea as we grew, based on sort of our own marketing and research, was to create something that we called verticals. And in March of 2010, we announced this direction. Verticals were a thematic homepages. So the ability to create a homepage based on any topic that you wanted to, anything you could invent, and the algorithm would adapt to that. And based on that level of interest, you could have like a more tech page, or maybe an automotive page, or if you were on a particular political mindset, something that was more specific and allowed you to basically create that fire hose effect for that individual vertical. And we spent a year doing a ton of work to create those verticals. And then at South by Southwest in March of 2010, I remember I was being interviewed about that. I was really excited about where that was going. My board of directors did not agree that that was the right direction. And so when I was kicked out in April of 2010, Kevin, who was still there, I think had this other idea, which I think was as risky as mine, or as ours, I should say, from before. which was to have a homepage that had a little bit more publication control. Like you can imagine like you would add like the New York Times if you wanted to have specifically to the New York Times. You'd have all these sort of, more publication oriented following where you could influence your homepage, you could personalize it using the publishers as the basis, as opposed to necessarily the theme. I can't tell you honestly which of those two would have performed better. We know that the second there was a perception that the publications influenced the homepage, it killed the trust between the user base and Dig. And that led to Dig's downfall. There's no question about it. I think if Kevin was here, if anybody was here, they would say, absolutely, that was a horrible mistake. However, if I had succeeded in implementing the verticals, that might have been just as bad. Like, we don't know. I cannot tell you that, if we had stayed the course, things would have been better. I think that it's compared a lot to subreddits today. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily all that much better. So, I can't say that there was a single mistake, but I do think that the key to all of it is that trust you have with your community. And if you are perceived, even inaccurately, at betraying that trust, it's over when you're in a crowdsourced type of business.
Yeah, I can imagine that the Dig users, especially because they'd finally found this home where it was kind of user controlled news content, that they were especially kind of attuned to any corporate media influence that they might see coming onto the platform. And that first sniff of that, would be outrage. So in some ways, it seems like the lost trust was foreseeable, but it also sounds like you guys felt there was a need to change. I guess my next question would be, if you hadn't made this big upgrade and you just stuck with Dig and Barry, is it possible that you, or I guess not you, because you left in 2010, but isn't it possible that Dig would be the Reddit of today?
100%.
If you just stayed the course.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that was sort of Dig's to mess up, and they messed up and lost the user base and lost that trust. There is no real right answer to that, though, because Dig had a business and we had investors and we needed to be self-sustaining. We weren't like Wikipedia, which was based on donations. We had invented some really interesting new forms of monetization. Like we had this thing called Dig Ads that Bob Book and a whole group of people had spent a great deal of time inventing. That was fantastic. It was the first real sponsored result, right? Which then Google, we all see that now in a Google result. But remember, this was the first of its kind. And I think that we needed to have a certain amount of consumer growth in order to drive those ads. So there was going to be pressure from the investors and everyone to invest in that growth, one way or the other. And as CEO of the company, it was my fiduciary responsibility to the board to pursue that growth. And I think that right there was probably the beginning of the end for me, because I felt more responsible to the community than I did the shareholders. And that right there, back to your first question, creates problems. And so, that if things had kept going, I'm not sure it would have been a viable business forever. It may have lived on in some fashion, but I'm not sure that it had found its business model. And anytime you are ads based, there's a certain corruption that is inherent in the system.
Yeah. Okay. And this is one that you might want to scroll away from the most. I've heard you. I'm a big fan of the Ask Jay segments. I was finding those valuable for years now, even well before I started doing the research on you for today's episode. But in one of those segments, you talk about how if a large company, especially a media conglomerate, approaches you with an offer for an acquisition, a big offer that lures you into the room with them, that you end up in your excitement spilling a lot of your secrets and your strategies, and that ultimately on the other side of the table, it might not actually have been genuine interest. It might have been kind of a scouting mission to find out what this small startup knows that we don't know, but that we can take and then re-implement in our own industry, in our own business. Is it possible that the reported $200 million offer from Google that ultimately fell apart was what you were referencing through this experience?
Honestly, when I did the Ask Jay episodes, that had already happened to me multiple times.
Oh, okay.
So I can answer, I think enough time has passed. I think I can answer with a little more detail about the Google offer. So, they offered 180 million to acquire Dig, and we had accepted. And when it fell apart, it was, after the diligence had already passed. So, I do not think that Google, when Marissa Mayer, who is the product champion who brought Google in to be acquired, I do not think at all that this was a brain drain kind of, strategy. I mean, Google was in the process of, doing Google Plus, and they had, she was responsible for Google News. And we genuinely thought that there was a 1 + 1 = 10 scenario. Now, when the deal fell apart, did they have all of our information? Sure. But I mean, that's a normal risk that you take when you engage in an acquisition discussion. But I do think, and I still believe, that this happens a lot, though, where a company, long before there's ever any term sheet or definitives, they're basically brought in. You're a young entrepreneur, you haven't been through it enough times, and there is a commitment that is made, even a term sheet that is made, purely just to sort of stir the pot, get some information, ultimately, maybe even lead you down a path and offer you a lower number, to get your team after your team's already been interviewed and now thought they were going to be a millionaire tomorrow and are no longer going to be one. All of these things are real tactics used by large companies. So it's very difficult to know the difference, because it's the same people who are doing the legitimate acquisitions who are also just doing their fact finding. And it comes down to, is there a strategic value to owning your business versus building their own? Is there something unique? Maybe your customers, your users, maybe an algorithm or intellectual property, maybe individuals, celebrities or what have you. Is there something unique about you that they can't replicate? And if the answer is no, then you need to probably not have that discussion, or at least be very, very close to the chest in terms of what you reveal.
Yeah, and that actually gets to exactly what I wanted to ask you next, which is, was there a level of self-delusion at Dig that you guys had established a defensive moat? Because in the end, it appears that maybe your defensive moat was the trust of your user base, or kind of the active engagement of the user base, and that maybe it was impossible to establish any other moat with this particular type of platform. But was there talk internally about, yeah, we have a defensive moat, or we're working to further establish the defensive moat? Was there a level of self-dilution that, these Dig users will be with us forever and they'll never leave us for Reddit? What was the moat when you guys talked to investors and VCs?
I think that we did feel that we had a brand and a community that was unique, that was well established. You know, if you think back to 2008 as an example, people talk a lot about, town halls and AMAs. Dig did that first with something that we called Dig Dialogue. And in 2008 at the Democratic National Convention, we had Nancy Pelosi, answering questions from the Dig users, right? And this is before Facebook ever did anything like that, right? We
Yeah.
did that live on CNN. That's how big Dig was. Dig was a great brand, a nerdy brand, but a really great brand. And I think that, as we were approached over the years with interest, not offers, interest in acquisition from companies like, Fox and Yahoo and others, I think we thought, well, this is something that we passionately believe in. This is intellectual property we've created that allows this to happen. We had patents on the like button, we had, and we had Kevin Rose, who I cannot stress enough, brilliant product genius who really had his finger on the pulse of the users and the community. I think that these were all very unique assets. And so were we confident? Sure, maybe overconfident. There was nothing else that was appearing on the landscape that was even close to competing with what we had. But back to the acquisition thing, remember, it has to be strategically valuable to that organization. And not all big media companies wanted to have big consumer-based, collaborative filters. Microsoft, as an example, just wasn't in the market back then to do anything like that, right? And the main companies that did have an interest were publications, like Gannett and places like Washington Post, which were trying to tap into this. But the second you entertained a conversation like that, you betray your neutrality as a crowdsourced medium. So it wasn't an easy thing to sell, but we did have confidence. I don't think we were deluded about our value at the time.
Okay. And as I'm sure you're aware, Dig is being revitalized in some ways today. Taking that brand value, which has definitely become nostalgic now that so much time has passed, and kind of revitalizing it and actually seeing some significant user growth, I think from 1.8 million to 10 million monthly active users as of late. Are you still in contact with the current Dig team, and what advice would you have for them as they look out to the next 5 years?
Oh, I'm not in touch with anybody on the current Dig team. I think I know that when John Borthwick and the folks, originally bought the brand after Dig was sold for parts, and they bought the brand, and I think LinkedIn got the patent on the like button and was sold around. After that moment, I don't think I've ever been in touch with anyone involved. Last I checked, it was still sort of an editorial, based, using the brand as a basis, but, fun content that was, a BuzzFeed kind of model, and nothing wrong with that at all. To revitalize it, to bring back the voting function, which to me is what Dig really was about. It was about that signal that needed to be from the users. If they are in fact going to do that, the list is long of things that we learned that would probably be valuable to them, that is still valuable. I have conversations with app developers today about reputation systems. We learned so much. Anton Kast, who is our head of R&D at Dig, spent his days with his team looking at those signals and how to sort of react and keep the gaming out of the system. And, there's a lot in there. Certainly, back to the beginning of this conversation, the information cascade is your enemy. Anything that would drive people to follow someone else and blindly click is a bad way of collecting signal. And so it depends on your goals, right? I almost think like the perfect, dig site in some ways isn't necessarily a fair and balanced site. It's a site that really sort of captures, sort of passions and interests and sensational ideas. And it could be a lot of fun, and that can be okay. But I think that you have to be honest with yourself and your users, sort of what your goals are, how you're monetized. If you're monetized based on having a higher number of monthly active users, I mean, let's just call it what it is. It's a popularity contest. And so, it really just depends. I do, and I will always believe that there is a place for democratized media. I remember having conversations with people who lived in other countries who their voice would not have been heard if it weren't for Dig. They would not have a place. When Arab Spring happened and we were all watching how Twitter had that impact, that was a big deal. And that showed how you could give a voice to, a squelched and oppressed group. So I don't know if Dig's aspirations are there. I'd love to talk to them if they are, because I do think that work needs to be done there, good work. But I spend my days with pinball machines, so.
Yeah. And before we wrap here, I do have two last questions that I ask every guest at the end of the podcast. But before we wrap, go ahead and give listeners the various places online where they can follow you, follow your work, stay up to date with what's going on at Scorebit and all your other projects that you advise or invest in, anything that you want listeners to go ahead and follow.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that the main thing, if you're interested in things that I've been up to, the Ask Jay Adelson on YouTube is still an active channel. I check it out, every few months and respond to some comments, from users, and they're welcome to go there. I am on Twitter, Jay Adelson on Twitter. And I sometimes even use it. And really, my current business is something called Scorebit. It is a small business that is in the pinball industry. There is an industry. And, I've decided to kind of focus on something that my son and I worked on together. And I have two co-founders, Ron Richards and Brian O'Neill. But if you go to Scorebit, that's scorbit.io, you can find us there and, find where to follow information on that on Facebook, Instagram, and everywhere. But, that's how to find me and stay in touch.
Great. And all that information will be in the show notes for listeners. And so last two questions for you here, a little out of left field. Bitcoin, any thoughts? Are you a believer? Is it the future of money and store of value technology? Where are we at?
Cryptocurrency is a thing. It's real. There's no backing out of this. There's no question that Bitcoin is a thing. And if there is a question, it's around how extensive crypto as a category is. Everyone got so excited about it that you can kind of overdo it. But no, these currencies are real and they provide value. Sometimes they do some very interesting, the blockchain is used for all sorts of things besides currencies that are really fascinating and useful applications like networks and, smart contracts and all sorts of great things. I am not personally someone who spends a lot of time on it because it is like a rabbit hole. And once you start, going down that rabbit hole, you could spend the rest of your life just in the universe of crypto. It's a fun one, though. I could see if I was like 20 years younger that I would be totally obsessed with crypto. But, it's like I find it fascinating. I like reading about it, but I'm not going to be in the business of crypto. But yeah, it's real.
Is it safe to say that you hold some crypto?
I do.
Okay.
I do. My partner, so I started a venture firm back in 2014 called Center Electric that was named after my late father's business. And when Andy Smith and I started that, what was really interesting was it was really right about the time that crypto was taking off. And Andy is way more knowledgeable about crypto than I am. And so we would sit at our desks, analyzing these IoT companies, and he would be talking about crypto stuff he was working on. I'd be talking about pinball stuff I was working on. So I picked up crypto from Andy, and I think Andy arguably already knew pinball, but he was learning a lot more than he probably bargained for. but yeah, I do hold some crypto thanks to him.
Yeah.
I think that NFTs and crypto and all of these things are a real thing. But you do have to pay attention and stay on it. Otherwise, you could lose your shirt, no question.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And last question for you today, Jay, is, are we living in a simulation?
Simulation, the Elon Musk question.
I don't know if he deserves credit for this. I mean, this has been
many people have been asking that question
beforehand.
for a long time. Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think, first of all, I do think it's possible we are, but I see no evidence that we are. And therefore, I find the question it's fun, but it's not really important. Because even if we are in a simulation, it holds no value to know that, because it's not going to change anything. But if you ask me, like, in my core emotionally what I think not.
Okay.
I don't think this is a simulation. But man, ever since I saw The Matrix, I've always wanted it to be true.
Yeah. And the new one's coming out, I think, next month.
I'm a sucker for cyberpunk. I always have been.
Yeah. And I think Keanu Reeves stole your haircut for this next one. Actually.
No. Did he go long hair?
Yeah, he did.
This is my pandemic cut.
Yeah. Well, Jay, if I could squeeze one last thought out of you, actually, is we have Thanksgiving coming around the corner. It's a very divisive time in America. Any thoughts on just how to approach these, cancel cultures, wokeism, any of these kind of hot topics today that might come up at the dinner table, and how to address that crazy uncle or just the disagreements that are naturally occurring throughout any group of people when they all sit together and share their thoughts and ideas? How should we address that dinner table?
I think that this is hard. This is hard for families to do in particular. But I have found that if you establish rules and boundaries at the beginning of the holiday, and you sit down and you say, hey, you know what? I love you very much. And I know that we don't always agree on everything, but let's agree that if one of us says something that affects the other emotionally, that's the first thing we tell the other person. When you just said that, this is what it made me feel. Before answering or reacting or calling the person wrong. Because I think a lot of times people don't know how it makes the other person feel. And then it becomes an emotional and intense reaction. That type of communication style fixes a lot of family problems, this boundary work. And if you can do that, I think that it will make for a more peaceful conversation. I have family members that are on the other side of the planet from me, right? And it's hard. Sometimes I will admit I intentionally bait them and I can't help myself. But that's important for them to say, hey, I know what you're doing here and I don't want to go there. Let's not, right? But everyone should just remember the most important thing here is to stay safe, get vaccinated, wear a damn mask, and just, stay out of trouble, because particularly with our older, family members, let's not kill them prematurely if we can help it.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful advice for the holiday season. And Jay, I want to thank you so much again for taking the time out. There's a lot of topics that I wish we could have gotten into today, like the situation in Detroit and whether that city is making a comeback. I know that's near and dear to your heart. Just so many other things that I pulled out of your commencement speeches that were really inspirational content and things that I wanted to dive into. So, maybe I'll have to have you on again in the future if you're willing. And just have a great holiday season. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you so much. And thanks for the thoughtful questions.
Thank you.